Okay, we are going to start off today's show with just kind of some talking about my new power rankings, which I updated for week 3. And we're going to go over the new AP poll, which I have just put into this AP column right here. And so we could see where teams rank in the AP poll versus where I have them ranked in my power ratings. But so let's just kind of go over the power ratings first. And again, these are all based on pure numbers. I have a video explaining all of this. This is not based on wins and losses. It is meant to be a reflection of how well teams play on a net basis. So net points per play, net yards per play. I don't care if you're good on offense and bad on defense. You have to be good in both to be successful in these power ratings. The higher the number, the better. And typically by the end of the season, the top teams will be above 125. You're seeing a lot of these. The best teams are ranked a little bit lower now because not many of them have played tough schedules so far. These rankings are meant to be predictive. I had Boston College covering the spread against Missouri last week. They did. They were actually leading that game 14-0 or 14-3 for a while. But just kind of wanted to go over um, the new iteration of the rankings here. So number 1, we've got Miami. Miami is they're really good. Points per play, yards per play, top 10, yards per attempt, net completion percentage, net first downs. Number 1 in explosive plays, and again, that's explosive plays gained and explosive plays allowed, defined as play of over 20 yards. Number 1 in net third down percentage. So Miami is they're graded out as statistically the most dominant team. Now, strength of schedule does factor into this. So if we just remove strength of schedule from the equation, which I use to kind of tamper down on some of the um, higher rated teams that haven't played anybody. So if we just delete these two columns and then sort that from Z to A, Miami goes from 1 to 3. Ohio State goes to number 1. Ole Miss to number 2. Tennessee moves up. Alabama, I believe, stays the same. Louisville and Indiana go up even higher. We'll talk about Indiana a little bit later. Texas goes down, and then Georgia goes down. So that's why we do strength of schedule, because Georgia has played Clemson, Texas has played Michigan. So Miami, Ohio State, Ole Miss, they've not played anybody even remotely close to a team of that caliber. So that's why we have strength of schedule to kind of make it fair, essentially. If you're putting up crazy numbers against terrible teams, then the ranking should not just assume that you play the same quality of competition as a team like Texas, who went up to Ann Arbor. But we'll talk first here about Georgia, and I want to just kind of preface this by saying I still think Georgia is a great football team. I still think that they can win the national championship. But I think where I have them in my power ratings, they fell down to number 2 in the AP poll after that close road win, 13-12 over Kentucky. Really didn't look great for basically the entire first half and a good portion of the second half. I think Georgia is closer to where I have them here at 5 than where they are in the polls. And the coaches poll still has them at number 1. But I think the real question about Georgia is not, are they as good as we thought they were going into the season, because that wasn't based on anything. And that's the real issue here. We are giving Georgia credit that I don't think that they deserve at this point. Yes, they have won back-to-back national championships in the past few years. They're a great team. They're a great team. But I think that we're giving them the Nick Saban Alabama treatment, where we basically say, for more than a decade with Saban, it was, coming in every season, it's Alabama's the best team until proven otherwise. every year for over a decade. And I think as soon as Saban retired, we just shifted that right over to Georgia. And I don't think it's warranted just yet. I really don't, because I don't know what I don't think Georgia has earned it yet. Now, of course, two national championships, but if that kick goes in against Ohio State, what are we saying? If Jamison Williams doesn't get injured in the national championship in the year before, I think Bama wins that game. What are we saying? Right. So I just don't think that Georgia has done enough to be considered the default number one team. And I just they have games like that against Kentucky. Seems like every year they go to Kentucky and they struggle. They're just on the struggle bus for an entire game essentially. And it happened to them in 2022. They still won the national championship, but they were also very beatable by a flawed Ohio State team. And Ohio State was on the verge of blowing them out in 2022. So this isn't nothing, right? I know we talk about, will teams improve over the course of the year, but they don't improve that much, I don't think. This is something. I mean, Georgia, they're banged up. They've got a lot of injuries, and that is a factor here. But so I don't want to overreact, but I just think that Georgia is not quite as good as they were cracked up to be. And I guess you could also get into the question of the whole idea of the preseason rankings in the first place. What was that based off of? That well, they're not as good as we expect them to be. Well, why did we expect them to be as good? The best team in the country, just because they were ranked number one in the preseason. Not really based on a whole lot. That's a whole different story. But I also just think basically the bottom line here is that I don't think Georgia is this, unstoppable 800-pound gorilla that is just going to steamroll everybody. I don't know what they're elite at. I've never been particularly impressed with Carson Beck. I think he's good, but I don't think he's special. It's weird. Stetson Bennett was special, but I don't know if he's, as good of a pure quarterback as Carson Beck. But Stetson Bennett just had that aura, that X factor, that indomitable spirit, the will to win. I don't see a whole lot of special with Carson Beck. I've never really been sold on his deep ball. Um, Kentucky did really well up front on both sides of the ball against Georgia. Um, it's possible that Georgia was looking ahead to Alabama. Both teams have byes coming up this week. The only difference is that Alabama went on the road to Wisconsin and just dominated. I think it was 41-10 or 42-10. And so right now, I've got them basically dead even, Georgia and Alabama. Now I give home teams 7 points. These numbers will change next week because things just other teams will change around them, even though they don't play. So their rankings will change because everything else, every other team is going to play, and their numbers will change. So those numbers will change, but I don't expect them to change too much. But basically, statistically, Georgia and Alabama are just about dead even here. Although statistically, if you remove strength of schedule, Alabama has been more impressive this season statistically, and Georgia's as close as they are because of their stronger strength of schedule. But I mean, if you look at net points per play, Alabama's better. Net yards per play, they're close, but Alabama's better. Net yards per carry, both decent but not elite. Net yards per attempt, Alabama's better. Close in net completion percentage, close in net first downs, close. I mean, they're very, very close statistically. Now, Alabama ranks 70th in net tackles for loss. I think a lot of that is just because Jalen Milroe takes a lot of sacks, takes a lot of hits. But net third down percentage, I mean, Georgia's not great. Alabama is great. I think Alabama's been more impressive statistically this year. And Alabama also I mean, if Georgia was looking ahead to Alabama, then why was Alabama able to overcome all that? They had a road game in Wisconsin. I mean, that's a very abnormal situation for them. So I'm going to be at the Alabama game, the Alabama Georgia game in 2 weeks. It's going to be a madhouse. Uh, I think I was not coming into the season. I was not expecting Georgia to win that game, but now I think, or I was expecting Georgia to win that game, but now I'm leaning Alabama. But we'll talk about that game more next week. But really, the thing is, um, I think it's premature to give Georgia the same respect that we gave Alabama during the run under Saban. Again, I still think Georgia's a top 3, 4 team, and Alabama hasn't been perfect either. Alabama had basically three and a half ugly quarters against South Florida. Did not look great, and but the thing is that was 2 weeks ago, and it gets overshadowed by their game against Wisconsin, and Georgia's is more recent. So that's all we're going to have as the most recent data point on Georgia over the next couple of weeks. So that's my thought about Georgia, Alabama. I don't think Georgia's quite as good as they were cracked up to coming into the season. I don't know exactly what they do elite. Like, what do they knock your socks off elite at? Um, I don't think, like, Ole Miss is incredible offensively. Ohio State has an amazing secondary. Texas offensively, hyper efficient. Tennessee just uh, a machine, and we might get into this a little later, possibly later in the week. But I think Tennessee's going to go into Norman, Oklahoma, and win pretty convincingly. Um, the next team I would like to talk about here is Oregon, who who improved by 23 spots. So they used to be 44 in my rankings after that dominant win against Oregon State. They improved quite significantly. They really got on track. They won 49-14. Looked like the Oregon team that we all kind of expected coming into the season. Full disclosure, I did take a nap during that game. That was my afternoon nap. And I didn't really get to see a whole lot of it. I saw the beginning, and then I woke up and it was 49-14. And I guess, Oregon was trying to figure some things out on the offensive line the first couple of weeks. But overall, I still think that even though Oregon looks like they got back on track against Oregon State, I still don't think that they are some elite juggernaut. I don't have them as a top echelon team. I just think that when you play an FCS team at home and you are in a 4-quarter dogfight, I just don't think there's any excuses for that. Not injuries, not lack of focus, not anything. I just don't think there's any excuses for. I mean, Idaho had the ball late in the fourth quarter with the chance to win that game, the chance to go down the field and take the lead. There's just no excuses for that. It's an FCS team. I know Idaho's a good FCS team, but there's just no excuses for that. There's nothing that you can say that will make me not concerned about that performance. There's just nothing. You can't erase that from my head. There's nothing you can't say like, whoa, well they had this guy missing on the no. You're Oregon. You are number 10 on the talent composite. You're playing against Idaho. You you maybe could sleepwalk for the first half, and I'd let you get away with it. But if you sleepwalk through 3.5 quarters, or I don't even know if that's sleepwalking. I think you can only sleepwalk through a half. I don't know that you can sleepwalk through a full game. I think if you are bad against a bad team for a whole game, then I think that means that you're not as good as we thought. And then we just talked about this with Georgia, right? You can sleepwalk through a half, but the whole game, I don't think. I think we have to readjust expectations at that point. So Oregon, I don't expect them to be as bad as they were the first couple weeks, and again, they almost lost to Boise State the following week too. So that's another sample, another data point against them. Um, they needed two return touchdowns to win that game, and one of those shouldn't have even counted. So Oregon, I don't think they are quite. Uh, the preseason hype got way out of control for Oregon. I still think they're good. I still think they're going to give Ohio State a battle next month, but I don't think that Oregon is on that Alabama, Ohio State, Texas level. I don't think so. I don't think they're not a top four program, and that's what they were expected to be coming into the season. So that's Oregon. The next team I want to talk about here is Indiana. And Indiana is unranked, but statistically, I've got them as a top 10 team, actually, the number 8 team in the country. They're the only team in my top 11 that is not ranked in the AP poll. Indiana is flying under the radar. They have a new coach, Kurt Signetti. He is kind of like a Kalen DeBoer type, where he came up from the lower ranks. He coached in D2. He most recently was a coach of James Madison when they moved from FCS to FBS. He went 52-9 at James Madison. He's 122-35 as a head coach. Again, he's like a Kalen DeBoer guy, where he comes up from the lower levels. All he does is win, and he just continues to win at the higher levels. He's just a winner. Um, and I think Indiana is a team that people are kind of sleeping on. Obviously, they're not even ranked in the ATP poll. So their first real kind of test against an FBS team was this past weekend. They went out to UCLA and they won 42-13. And now UCLA is horrible. They might be the worst team in the Power Five. They're probably the worst team in the Big Ten. But Indiana beat them like a top 15 or 20 team would beat UCLA, and especially on the road. And that was Indiana's first time playing a road game at the Rose Bowl. A unique scenario, right? And Indiana didn't miss a beat. They just went out there and dominated. And they again, it looked like India or UCLA, not a great team, but Indiana beat UCLA like a good team, a really good team would beat UCLA. Like that's like what Ohio State would go out there and do. That's what Texas would go out there and do. They'd win 42-13. And statistically, Indiana checks out and everything except for the talent composite. Um, they're elite in yards per play, elite in points per play, yards per carry, top 10, yards per passing attempt, top 4, net first downs, red zone touchdowns, net third downs, tackles for loss. Everything checks out with Indiana. And obviously, we need to wait a little while, to see them against some legit competition because this is not an uber talented team. They're only 47th in the talent composite. But Indiana is a team that's flying under the radar. And a lot of it is because they went 3-9 last year, and they only had one win over a Power 5 team, which was Wisconsin. But they also were in some close games. Louisville, Illinois, Purdue, Michigan State. They were down 17-14 to Penn State on the road at halftime last year, ended up losing by 9. Last year they played Ohio State in week 1. They lost 23-3. Obviously, offensively didn't really have anything going, but defensively they kind of hung in there against Ohio State last year. I think Indiana should be ranked. I think they should probably be somewhere in the 20 to 25 range. But the more interesting thing about Indiana is that they're probably going to continue winning. They're probably going to be 6-0. Their next 3 games are Charlotte, Maryland, and at Northwestern. Maryland's not very good. They lost to Michigan State. Charlotte, that should be a win. And Northwestern is pretty horrible. After they presumably go 6-0 Indiana, they will play Nebraska at home. So it's an Indiana home game against Nebraska. That was not a game that anyone was expecting to be good coming into the season. I think it will be. Nebraska probably should be undefeated. Indiana should probably be undefeated. They're both going to be ranked. If they're both undefeated, they'll both be ranked. Um, that's going to be a really good game 4 weeks from now. But the more interesting thing than that is if Indiana wins that home game, and statistically, they're slightly better than Nebraska. Right now, I would have them favored by about 7 over Nebraska on a neutral site. And then double digits at home. And Nebraska's good, but I think Indiana's better. Um, After Nebraska, if Indiana does win that game, they host Washington at Michigan State and then host Michigan. They could very well be undefeated going into the Michigan game. And if they continue playing like this, Michigan hasn't looked very good. They could beat Michigan, which would then set up a 10-0 start potentially. Now, I don't think it's going to happen. I think they're going to have a slip up along the way. Most likely being against Nebraska or Michigan, but again, those games are at home. They could be 10-0 going to Ohio State in the second to last game of the season, and Ohio State was not expecting that to be a tough game. That was expecting that to be a tune-up game against Indiana before Michigan. But could you imagine if Indiana comes into that game and they're ranked or they're 10-0, ranked in the top 10? I'd love to see it. But I don't think they're going to beat Ohio State. I think they will probably lose to either Michigan or Nebraska, possibly both. But there's a very real shot that Indiana goes 9-3 this year, and a decent chance that they win 10 games. I mean, it's entirely possible that they only lose one game. So Indiana is actually in a pretty interesting spot here. I think they, as crazy as it sounds, they have an outside chance to make the playoff. And there's even a chance that they go 10-0 and go into Ohio State 10-0, which would be awesome. So Indiana flying under the radar, not a lot of people talking about them, and they should be ranked in the next few weeks here. And it's kind of hard to believe in a team that went 3-9 last year, but they had a lot of close games. They've got a new coach who's a winner. Don't sleep on Indiana. Other than that, the next thing, and I'm going to do this in another video, but we'll talk about Michigan, USC coming up. We'll talk about Michigan. Alex Orji is now the starter, replacing David Warren. So we'll talk about that probably in another video. I'll probably try to do a breakdown of Michigan's game against Arkansas State. But that's what's coming up. Move over to my tiers here. Just kind of go through and see what we change after last week. Got the top 4 here, and I still think that Georgia does belong in that top 4 or 5 range. I don't think I would move them down into this area just yet, but the days of them being in a tier by themselves are gone. I would probably be willing to move Oregon up to playoff caliber if we see more out of them, which would make them, a top 12 team as opposed to a top 25-ish team. Missouri could be in there, but the question is, I just don't know how good Boston College is. I think they're pretty good. I have them in my decent tier, but I think, Missouri probably a little bit overrated, so I have them in the fraud list. fraud alert area. LSU, not sold on them. They probably should have lost to South Carolina. Oklahoma, if we go back to the power ratings, again, they play Tennessee this week. So luckily it's at home for Oklahoma, but I have Tennessee ranked number 7. Oklahoma's all the way down here at 38. Oklahoma is not elite at anything other than their roster. And I think Tennessee goes in there. Tennessee has been incredibly impressive, and I think Tennessee goes in there and gets a win. Um, that's gonna do it. Just kind of wanted to do a recap, kind of the main headlines of the weekend, and go over the latest power ratings. We'll have some more content coming out later in the week, probably hopefully tomorrow. But if you enjoyed the video, if you got this far, hit the like button, and we'll see you in the next one.